I won't give up on us, even if the skies get rough. I'm giving you all my ships. I'm still looking up. Yeah, well, that's an adaptation, because today we're looking at the Washington Treaty issues again. But specifically, we're looking at carriers. And so I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction before we get into it all. And carriers are cool. Carriers are wonderful. Carriers are lovely. Carriers are also possibly the issue which is the most complicated. Because honestly, carriers in 1920, 1922 don't really exist. You're probably looking and go, but Alex, there are these ships in service. There are a couple of ships in the service. There are a couple of ships being built. But honestly, they are all experimental. There is a reason the Royal Navy gets away with writing off pretty much every carrier before Courageous as being an experiment under the treaty systems, so they can change them when they wish. They are experimental. They can get rid of them. They do not count. They do not count. So that means defining something for an aircraft carrier becomes much more complicated. And what you're going to build becomes even more complicated, because how do you project, as I can do with as I did with the battleships, the capital ships, I went and looked at what is the largest one in existence, plunk from that. Well, the largest one in existence at this point isn't in existence, really. It's one of the great joys is going through the various Excel spreadsheets of ships and working out when they come into service from this. And mostly we're talking, most of the ships do not come into service. And Furious is a good example. 22,900 tons when finally in service. And yet she doesn't really come into, she isn't really properly in service till 1926 in her carrier form. Prior to that, it's Eagle with 22,000 tons. So honestly, you can argue they're being generous when they set things up the way they do. They're being more than generous. However, there is an interesting thing going on. There are some sums being done, and there are some ideas put forward from the carriers. And it comes into that whole ratio and equitable treaty thing, and that's my big problem, because to make the equitable treaty on capital ships, I have to adjust, of course, the ratio, which I've done. Which means, despite there being a good logical argument that the carriers were about as equitable as they could get on the knowledge they had, I still have to adjust it. I have to think it through, because otherwise I am ignoring a very large area of logical consequence for making an equitable treaty. There is also the reality that it wasn't really equitable in terms of carriers. And I say this because Italy and France get a very interesting allocation when it comes to carriers in terms of operational capability, which is problematic. There is also the issue with conversion ships and whether or not you're giving them a massive tonnage advantage in terms of putting them in service with aircraft aboard, or whether you're actually shooting yourself in the foot, because a conversion can never match a purpose built of the same tonnage. So you artificially have to limit the purpose built to a lesser tonnage. Basically, the aircraft carrier section is going to sound the closest of any of these videos in this series to a wish fleet scenario. It is probably, because I'm adjusting it to fit the treaty limits as established in the capital ships. But I'm not really changing around that much. So, as you can see, coming up, we have the capital ships happened on the Washington Treaty, aircraft carriers, this is it. Other ships and fortifications are going to be on the 2nd of June. Then on the 3rd of June, there's going to be a UAD video of a potential fleet action. Then overall Equitable Treaty on the 4th of June. If I can get UAD to work, that's for the 3rd of June. Capital ships for the London treaties, they're sort of combined in this one, for the 5th of June 2022. Aircraft carriers, 6th of June 2022. What's an equitable version of those? Then, of course, the 7th of June, we have the Pensacola class. 8th of June, it's cruisers. 9th of June, it's destroyers. Sloops and other ships on the 11th of June. And fortifications on the 12th of June. And overall Equitable Treaty on the 13th of June. Now, I have to admit, the fortifications on the 12th of June could be an interesting one, but it could also be a long discussion of the various islands in the Pacific. But they are all being in the process of being written. They are all being in the process of being done. And as you can see, this is basically what are going to be going on every day in terms of long patrols while I'm away. Now, here's a good question. And of course, when I come back the 14th of June, so that gives me an extra sort of little sort of day's break of recovery. Always good to have one of those. Is the next class in the cruiser patrol, which is a cruiser series, which is of course the Guyana class of the Regia Marina. So that's going to be a fun time. There will be lives while I'm away. I'll discuss this more at the end, but those will be sort of things which will happen if I'm able to with the hotel, etc. And they will probably be done with the bare minimum of tech support. So we'll probably be phone-based streaming. I know how you all love that, but that's probably the way I'll go. Anyway, I hope you're looking forward to this series. I hope you're enjoying this series so far, and I hope you enjoy aircraft carriers. So, why is there not live saying? Why are you being treated to a long patrol on the aircraft carriers that could have been, and the Equitable Treaty there could have been, agreed at Washington instead of alive? Well, I'm off with Justin Craig. Now, what is Justin Craig? I've answered this question a couple of times, and I'm going to talk about it again. Justin Craig are a revision firm. They are one of the oldest, in fact, the oldest in the UK, that do revision in the way they do. We do small group work, usually 5 or 6 students in the class at maximum, often as little as 1 or 2. This is why when I say I am running a centre at this point, I am running a place called St George's, which is a residential centre, which means I'm in there 24 hours a day. I have boarders. I have all sorts of people I'm looking after. That is what I'm doing. I am being course director, headmaster. I am wearing a bright purple top and chatting away with kids and helping to make sure they get the best they can out of the experience. And that's what Justin Craig is about. So that is where I am. I am off helping A-level and GCSE students with their revision. And probably getting fed a lot of food, because the one thing I will also add about Justin Craig is that if in doubt, there is always food. They're a good company. They are good for revision, and there is a link down below where you will find them. If you do call up and do decide that you want to do some A-level or GCSE revision with them, and Please note, I'm not being paid for the ad or anything like that, or this video is not sponsored by them or anything like that, but I am, of course, working for them while I'm away, and I have worked for them, as I said earlier, for 13 years, 10 years as a course director. They are good. Please tell them I sent you, because it's nice for them to hear that one of their staff recommended them. But they are really nice people. And in fact, I will go further, because I will start naming names, because if we carry on this a bit, I can point out Paul. He's one of my bosses. He is not a course director, but he often comes down to centres and is helping out with assisting the course directors when they're setting up the first session. He is a really, really nice guy. He's often the person I have to phone up in the office when I have an issue and I'm solving it out and I'm going, Paul, you need to know about this issue because I've now solved it, but I have a feeling that when the parents hear about it, they're going to want to talk and check it will solve properly. Paul is that guy. And he is really, really nice. And that is the thing about Justin Craig. It's nice from the top to the bottom. Yes, they're a company. They are out to make a profit. There is nothing wrong in that in the world. But they are really nice about the way they go about it. And there's Usha. She's one of the English teachers. She's really friendly and really helpful. There are other adverts you can see for them online, and that's what I've put a link to their channel down below, because honestly, they are really friendly and really helpful, and it's an honor and a pleasure to work for them. And yeah, the centers are a lot of fun. The summer schools especially. This is not an advertisement for the summer school, but I often run summer schools for them. And have great fun. We have campfires where I do popcorn over the campfire, s'mores, the lot, and they can see London from where we are. This sort of London's twinkling in the distance, and it's late at night. They're all going, ooh, we're up late, and I'm going, yes, and it's a school night, and the resident adults don't care because, well, it's part of the experience. You know, they're coming to revise over the summer to learn and get ahead over the summer. They need to have a bit of fun as well, and that's what we try and do. Justin Craig. It's never going to be cool. It's a revision company. And it's about learning. But it is about learning in as fun an atmosphere as you can and as supportive an atmosphere as you can. And that's why it's a pleasure to do it. Anyway, without much further ado, let's get back to today's topic, which is Equitable Treaty of the Washington Treaty and aircraft carriers. What would have happened? So, let's start off with the ratio debate. Now, this actually got me into trouble with a couple of viewers because they were going, well, hang on, it was 1.75 overall. It wasn't for capital ships, technically. It was 1.66. Yes, it was. So they got exactly 5 ships, which meant it went down even more. That doesn't, it's going to sound strange. It actually sounds better when you say 1.75 than when you say 1.66, because that means it's even worse. And it is worse. That originally proposed by the US was as this. The eventually agreed upon for capital ships was this. 553, 1.66, 1.66. To average it out to 1.75 for Marine Nationale and Regia Marina, they get a bump in carriers. RN goes to 5, USN goes to 5, IJN to 3, and Marine Nationale 2.2, and Regia Marina 2.2. Now, this is where we get into an interesting discussion. Why did I not cover this in the first one? Honestly, I did cover this. Slide is actually out of the first presentation, but it just didn't make the cut because it was already 2 hours long. This one, because it's not got UAD in it, is actually almost easier to add these stuffs in because I'm not going to make it massively long. The point about this is that eventually they average out to the proposal. But you can be sure both the USN and Royal Navy are not perceiving the carrier as a great force equalizer. that's going to give the Marine Nationale and the Regia Marina a decisive advantage. And even if it does, they feel very secure in their 2-to-1 superiority in numbers. However, again, it becomes a source of ire for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Because if we consider the time, they are the first proposal, they are just about half basically they will build 6 ships for every 7 the combined Marine Nationale and the Regia Marina has. Well, no, hang on. Yeah. Because together, the Marine Nationale and Regia Marina equals 3.5, and so for every 7 they get, IJN has 6. However, think about this in terms of carriers. If carriers do turn out to be successful and important, and air power is growing at this point, well, you have an issue. The Marine Nationale and the Regia Marina now have 4.4 for every IJN's in comparison. And the IJN has to face 5 from the USN and the RM. In other words, their position has been eroded. Their position is even lesser than carriers. And it becomes a source of even greater ire. It's also a reason why they start to shift so many duties on their carriers to their cruisers in terms of reconnaissance aircraft, and are keen for that to be the capability. Because, again, allows them to focus their theoretically limited legitimate tonnage on the duties they want their carriers to do. In other words, something in the treaty which, on the face of it, isn't that bad because no one knows how capable and how viable aircraft carriers are, actually turns out to be a major problem as time goes on. Who'd have thunk it? Being unfair and making random concessions can actually cause more trouble. There will be sarcasm in this discussion, by the way. So here is the treaty as applied to aircraft carriers. Article 7. Total tonnage of aircraft carriers of each of the contracting powers shall not exceed in standard displacement for the United States, 135,000 tons. For the British Empire, 135,000 tons. For France, 60,000 tons. For Italy, 60,000 tons. For Japan, 81,000 tons. The placement of aircraft carriers shall be effected only as prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 3, provided, however, that all aircraft carrier tonnage in existence or building on the November 12th, 1921 shall be considered experimental and may be replaced within the total tonnage limit prescribed in Article 7 without regard to its age. Article 9. No aircraft carrier exceeding 27,000 metric standard displacement tons shall be acquired by or constructed for or within the jurisdiction of any of the contracting powers. However, any of the contracting powers may, provided that its total tonnage advance allowance of aircraft carriers is not thereby exceeded, build not more than 2 aircraft carriers, each a tonnage of not more than 33,000 tons standard displacement. In order to effect economy, any of the contracting powers may use for this purpose any 2 of their ships, whether constructed or in the course of construction, which would otherwise be scrapped on the provisions of Article 2. The armament of any aircraft carriers exceeding 27,000 tons standard displacement shall be in accordance with the requirements of Article 10, except the total number of guns to be carried in the case of any such guns would be of caliber exceeding 6 inches, except any aircraft guns and guns not exceeding 5 inches shall not exceed 8. Article 10. No aircraft carrier of any contracting power shall carry a gun with a caliber in excess of 8 inches. That's 203 millimeters. Without prejudice to the provision of Article 9, if the aircraft carried includes guns includes guns exceeding 6 inches in caliber, the total number of guns carried except anti-aircraft guns and guns not exceeding 5 inches shall not exceed 10. If, alternatively, the armament contains no guns exceeding 6 inches in caliber, the total number of guns is not limited. In either case, the number of anti-aircraft guns and guns not exceeding 5 inches is not limited. Okay. Well, that seems fair. The Royal Navy's being allowed 5 carriers. The US Navy's being allowed 5 carriers. The IJN's being allowed 3. And, well, let's be honest. France and Italy are being allowed 2 and less than a third. Or they're being allowed 1 conversion and 1 carrier. 1 33,000-ton ship and 1 27,000-ton ship. That's what you're allowed, France and Italy. Japan, well, if they have a 33,000-ton ship, they're in trouble. Because 33,000 tons, if they get 2 of them, that's 66,000 tons. And that leaves them with a whopping 15,000 tons of carrier left. Oh, I can feel the burn, especially considering Argus is 14,450 tons. Ooh. We consider it's the same for America and Britain. You build those 66,000 tons of carrier, you're in trouble. You build 66,000 tons of carrier, and you've used up over half your allowance. Well, nearly half, let's be honest. Yeah, okay, you're 1,500 tons under half. But in practical terms, you're in trouble. You've got 68,500 tons left, which means you could build 2 27,000-ton carriers for 54,000 tons used. Okay. I did say you had, let's see, 67.5 plus 1.5 is 69. So let's work that out. 15,000 tons again left. So you're allowed 1 15,000-ton carriers, 2 27,000-ton carriers, and 2 33,000-ton carriers. That's not a lot of aviation. The trouble is, let's be honest, the aircraft of 1924 are not really a worry to a Navy. Yeah, you got torpedo planes, but how long range do they? How accurate are they? How reliably are torpedoes dropping? We often pretend like the quality of torpedo drops that you see in World War II are almost automatically what you get. They aren't. The Royal Navy, for years, is just dropping torpedoes. Then they develop the wooden fins. And then, as time goes on, they develop that very lovely tension cable. All those things build up to make the Swordfish the very, very reliable torpedo dropper it is. All the iterations along that design, from Sopwith Cuckoo to Fairy Swordfish, are what create what it becomes. So, in short, what's the individual limit? 27,000 tons, standard, but there's you're allowed 33,000 tons for contracting powers. But there's a phrase there which I do find interesting. Now, any of the contracting powers may, provided that its total tonnage allowance of aircraft carriers is not thereby exceeded, build not more than 2 aircraft carriers, each a tonnage of not more than 33,000 tons standard placement, and in order to effect economy of any of the contracting powers may use for this purpose, any 2 of their ships, whether constructed or in the course of the construction, which would otherwise be scrapped under the provisions of Article 2. There's a lot of maze there, and it's something when you start talking to students about this, you go, there are maze there. Yeah. That means you don't have to. That means you're expected to, but legally you don't have to. you could have started from scratch. Let me say that again. In theory, the nations who are building these 33,000-ton ships could have. They didn't, because basically the subtext was you will use conversions, but that's not as it's written, because there are the nays in it. You could have, in theory, built from scratch. You could have seen America, Britain, Japan all build 33,000-ton carriers from scratch in the 1920s. 2 of them. Where are they getting the 33,000-ton figure from? What is attracting them to this? Why are they allowing up to 33,000 tons? Well, in a way, it is related to the battleships, related to their tonnages, but there's also some maths going on. It's based on what's was building and has just entered service. And notice I don't have the Langley here. Because for treaty limits, really, the Langley doesn't get referred to as much in discussions as you'd think. What's being referred to is these 4. In the discussions, the side discussions, and the various books and articles and papers I've read, these 4 seem to be the ones being discussed the most, so they're the 4 I'm using as my example. Furious would come into service and be launched in the carrier configuration in 1925, Eagle 1924, Hermes 1924, and Hosho 1922. Now, there are some interesting figures here, and I want to talk about them. Year launched, that's an interesting figure. The displacements, they're kind of interesting. The standard displacements, as listed in treaty documents, and when I say as listed in treaty documents, I mean in sort of documents around the treaties. They aren't actually physically listed in the treaty proper. Mainly because they don't exist when the treaty's been done. 22,500 long tons for Furious, 21,850 tons long tons for Eagle, 10,850 long tons for Hermes, and 7,470 long tons for Hosho. Here is the point. Look at the standard ton per aircraft carried, and look at those figures. Furious, 625 tons per aircraft. She's a conversion. Eagle is a conversion. Between 874 and 728, depending on how many large aircraft versus a spotter reconnaissance aircraft she's carrying versus fighters. Hermes, 542.5 tons per aircraft. Good Lord, that is 80 tons per aircraft less. 82.5 tons per aircraft less than Furious. And air group wise, she's not so dissimilar from Eagle that you aren't going, well, that in Eagle's biggest condition, yeah, theoretically, Eagle's about 332 tons per aircraft more expensive. And remember, under the treaty limits, tonnage per aircraft is an expense. You are limited in total tonnage. Hosho is the most efficient there. 498 tons per aircraft. So, constructed aircraft carriers are far more efficient. And, of course, here is the thing. As a carrier gets bigger, usually the proportion of space it can allocate to aircraft storage and aircraft gets greater and actually far more efficient. Now, what am I meaning when saying this? Well, here's the thing. I don't have to think about tonnage or anything like that. What you have to think about is terms of the hangar deck. Okay, so one of the big differences we often bring up when we're talking about Royal Navy versus carrier versus US Navy aircraft is the inclusion of numbers of aircraft which are stowed in pieces in the very high hangars, which the US do, but also deck parking, which the Royal Navy don't do. The reason the Royal Navy don't do deck parking is because boom, boom, and boom, all lost aircraft in various points in the North Atlantic and the North Sea. So the Royal Navy stopped doing deck parking, because you could do deck parking in the Mediterranean. They knew you could do deck parking in the Mediterranean, but they didn't bother to include that in their numbers of peacetime aircraft, because frankly, in peacetime, they could be deploying the aircraft anywhere, the carrier anywhere, and therefore they needed to carry aircraft that would actually get there. They didn't think any aircraft deck parked would get there. They thought they'd be destroyed by enemy action, or they'd be destroyed by the sea. Either way, they would no point carrying them. It affects your air group numbers. But what massively affects your air group numbers is the size of your hangar. Even in cases where you're doing deck parking and you're storing aircraft up, your size of your hangar, i.e. the footprint size of the hangar. The larger the aircraft carrier, the less proportional space is taken up by the trunking and things for your island structure, and for the other officers you need and things that might be put around the carrier. You have more footprint space. You still need roughly the same amount of space, no matter how big carrier you have. Here's a good example of space to actually put things in them. So Furious is quite an efficient design for her period, because even though she has a flying off deck below, and it's the period style of, which is really quite cool, of rounded front for good airflow, then coming down, and then sort of almost a ramp for aircraft to land on. So they land on and then just going uphill as they're trying to slow down, because at this point, when you do have arrestor cables fitted, they're not across the deck. They're lengthwise. They're not latitudinal. They're longitudinal, to stop you falling off the deck, which happens when aircraft land sometimes. So they have arrestor cables literally to arrest them from falling off the side of the ship. It's later on they go latitudinal and wait, oh, I've been stopped. These things take up space. Lifts take up space. You need lifts. British like to build them internally. They do sometimes consider externally. There is a debate actually when around some of the scenarios around the conversion of potentially an Admiral class into an aircraft carrier or a G3, whether or not they might have had a deck edge flight deck lift, might have had a sort of outside flight deck, because the British are keener on that idea when they're looking at what they're talking about as a strike carrier, which would have been a roughly 30,000 ton vessel. It's an interesting thing to look at and think about. Honestly, most of the discussions I found for it are in personal papers of naval constructors and people attached. So it is likely as much spitballing as it is realistic. Unless I can find plans in Camel Laird and the Wirral archives of Camel Laird's, or the Tyne and Weir archives of Vickers, or in the National Archives, I suppose, but I've been looking at those for a long time and I haven't found it so far. Or maybe some of the archives up in Govan, but especially those for John Brown and Co. I won't ever be able to prove it, whether it was more than vaporware. But they were certainly, I think, looking into the idea. It's kind of like the triple turret. It's something which they're looking at, but actually getting them to pull the trigger, difficult. So efficiency advantage goes to the purpose-built ships. In fact, a 27,000-ton standard-built ship, according to this, built to an average of the per-ton figures of Hermes and Hosho, can conservatively support an air group of 52 aircraft. And as said, carriers get more efficient. You build them. For example, the 22,000 long-ton standard carrier in a standard HMS Ark Royal could carry 72 aircraft. While with 5,000 tons more, she'd probably end up looking like Implacable. If you built a 33,000 ton or a 27,000 ton version of Ark Royal, standard, you probably end up something not too dissimilar to the Implacable class, with about 70 to 80 aircraft and with armor. Think about that. Because, again, the whole armor thing doesn't come out of nowhere. Ark Royal's flight deck is a strength deck. It's not armored, but it's certainly strong. And so is the hangar deck. It's a stepping stone to actually fitting armor there that you fit thick steel. Illustrious class fit armor. The Implacables, well, they are Ark Royals in terms of their size and scope, but with illustrious level armor. You can do that on 27,000 ton standard displacement. You cannot do that on 22,000 ton standard displacement. The British are trying to build as much as they can on 22,000 ton standard displacement, because if we put 22,000 tons into 135,000 tons, well, you get six carriers. And it was worth it to get that sixth carrier. It was that essential to have aircraft carrier numbers. The British lead the world for pretty much up until almost until their losses in the Second World War, and even for a bit after they've lost a lot of their losses, thanks to American losses. They have the most carriers in operation of any nation in the world. That's a scary thing to say. Trust me, it's as scary for me as to say it as for people probably to hear it, because yes, I'm a British historian. Yes, I'm a naval. My PhD's in naval aviation. But when you say that in conferences, even in academic conferences, even in the UK, people look at you funny, because that is not what they expect to hear. The British were always worried about numbers of aircraft and numbers of aircraft carriers. Why though? Even before the advent of the strike-capable carriers, we understand, the aircraft, the carriers of aircraft which could sink battleships, could sink other ships reliably. Why? Trade protection and fleet protection. There was a large part of the Jutland scenario which was put down to German aerial reconnaissance. In various other operations, it was put down to German aerial reconnaissance. Carrying fighters with the fleet to do counter-reconnaissance work and take out enemy searchers was considered absolutely critical, as was carrying aircraft with the fleet to do reconnaissance. And, in the case of the Blackburn, to also do spotting and target your guns. Because, yes, my aircraft might not be able to carry a weapon that can actually kill the ship, but my battleship certainly can. And in this case, it's a distributed lethality. It's not as old, not as new as we like to think. It's literally Blackburn equals sensor node. Spotting. In visual range of target, in visual range of ship it's guiding the guns of. But they're not in visual range of each other. It works. But, in fact, according to the average figures of Furious and Eagle, to get 52 aircraft on a converted carrier, it will need to equal 38,500 tons. Now, I know the Saratogas do a better job than that. I do. Saratoga and Lexington do a better job. Well, Lexington's. I like them the Saratogas. I believe that. But the fact is, this is the best sums that people have when they're making this treaty. This is the sums they have. And navies are technically minded services and are doing the work that makes these sums. They are thinking it through. This is a good example. This is HMS Eagle. Now, I'm going to be discussing some things later, but I want you to bear in mind that island structure. That is a very interesting island structure, because when they are designing Eagle and her island structure, she's actually the first carrier that they actually think about the possibility of there being a flag officer. Now, I have to admit, and I will admit this quite freely, the facilities in the design for flag officers, etc., and the staff to be accommodated on Eagle are not amazing. There is a reality that it rarely happens. But certainly, if you were considering what another vessel might be a conversion built at the same time, which was supposed to be a more prominent vessel, would have a likely island structure like, it is worthwhile looking at Eagle. Eagle is a good model to build from. So, basically, if you are thinking about doing a drawing of what you think an Admiral or a G3 or any other larger British ship which could have been converted to a carrier would look like, and would have suitable space for an Admiral staff, you'd be looking at Eagle. Now, she's of course a converted battleship, the Amarante Cochrane. And I find it annoying that she isn't actually left as Cochrane, because I think Admiral Cochrane would have been a great one to have an aircraft carrier named after. I also think that Eagle has become a name associated with aircraft carriers almost as much as Ark Royal in the Royal Navy. And the fact that we don't have an Ark Royal or an Eagle at the moment is quite upsetting in some regards. But what I would say also is more a case is that if it had been a Cochrane, HMS Cochrane, it would have been an even bigger thing. The name would have echoed through generations. And Cochrane, as an innovator and as a figure to rally naval aviation behind in the 1920s, could have been very useful. But no, they go with Eagle. Which is also sort of apt, because let's be honest, Eagles are cute. So what would have been an equitable treaty? Now, this is getting complicated. Using the precedent of how the cruiser standards were decided upon, 27,000 tons is fair and sensible. I.e., going for the largest theoretical ship they could probably be looking at. However, that's in relation to 35,000 tons on the capital ships. And
whilst the largest conversion proposal was 33,000 tons, if you go back and remember that again, they're also talking about maize, so you could theoretically build a 33,000 ton carrier as long as you only built 2 of them. So I decided to go for an individual ship limit of 33,000 tons. I thought it's historical, it's in the treaty, and 33,000 tons does produce some very interesting figures. The treaty ratio, 5/5, IJN 3, and MN 2.2, Marine Nationale 2.2, Radio Marina 2.2. The Equitable Treaty capital ship ratio is 10, 10, 7, 4, and 4. And this is the point. In terms of the treaty ratio, it's a 1-to-3 ratio in terms of it works out in terms of tonnage to the cap between the capital ships and the carriers. So the carriers make up sort of 25% of your capital force. You can think of that in that sort of way. I don't want to massively dramatically increase the carriers of the Royal, in numbers, but I also don't want to dramatically increase the battleships and the capital ships, and I don't want to also start playing around with weird figures and start trying to make a treaty, cut this treaty down to sort of this ratio down, because that would invalidate the equitable nature of that ratio. And we established this ratio is equitable. It does fit with everyone's requirements. So that became my limit. Now, that makes things very different than reality. I am not going to say it doesn't. It makes a huge difference between them and reality. 200,000 tons of difference. Okay? But these two, 200,000 tons worth of difference. Not far off it on this one. But these, well, that takes it up to 132,000 tons, each of them allowed, from 60,000 tons. Their allocation. Even compared to the old generous ratio. So this is the point at which I have to admit, it does start to sound a bit unhistorical. The only points I can draw it from to try and make my point and make it with history and say it's an equitable one which does fit with history is that the 33,000 tons figure comes from the Washington Treaty, and whilst it is there and as it's interpreted and often implemented, it's supposed to apply to conversions, thanks to the maize, there is the potential of it being applied to new builds as well. Not in practice, but it's implied as viable. And if this is the Equitable Treaty of capital ships, and as I've said, I've linked that back to the capital ships and the discussions of that, it seems fair that this is an equitable treaty compared to what they had. And I would have had to take that to 3.5, 5, 5, and 2, and 2 in terms of ship ratios, in terms of ship number units, to get it down and keep the ratios broadly the same. And that didn't seem right. Because it also doesn't fit with what I established at the beginning of this. I don't like and don't consider it fair when you give people partial ships. It doesn't matter whether it's 1.66, 1.75, or what it is. If it's a partial ship allowance and only works when you sort of multiply things up, it's adding complexity and it's adding room for and scope for trouble. So if we're going to keep it to whole numbers, sadly, prime number sitting there. It can't be put down that. And no one, these aren't going to accept less than them. And they're not going to accept equality of numbers between the three of them. So 10, 10, 7 it is. And then the Marine Nationale and the Regia Marina, 4 each. They're happy. They won't do anything with it, but they'll be happy because they're equal. And here is HMS Hermes. You notice again another large island structure? Why did the British put so much into their island structures? What are they building in them? Believe it or not, the idea is that if you have the space in the island for organizing the pilots and briefings and those sort of things, then the pilots are ready to go. So you can bring the aircraft up, and the pilots and aircrew are ready, and boom, off as quickly as possible. It's one of the ideas of organization, and honestly, it's a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other scenario. It also allows them to build up the funnel as high as they can, because they like to get the smoke away. There are issues with some of the other carrier designs, and they try various things. You know, Furious starts off with having trunked funnels and various things organized. And the point is, the British realize very quickly that nothing can start taking and restricting your space in hangar more than by having a funnel running through your hangar. But there again, they have a lot of ships to try this out with. They have Courageous and they have Glorious. And they have Furious, Hermes, Eagle, and Argus. So, all this has created an obvious problem, apart from the massive allowances of aircraft carriers. Okay, that would have a major impact on World War II. I have pretty much changed the entire course of World War II at this point, I do admit. An equitable treaty system means that the Allied powers would have still kept up a level of construction and infrastructure, which meant they would not have seemed as easy to meet or exceed for the opposition powers, for the Axis powers. But also, you've kept up a level of construction going for the Japanese, which means that they will always be able to have the hope that they can their new ship will be so good that it doesn't matter that anyone has superiority over them in numbers, that their quality is going to trump the quantity. And it also will have an impact on Germany and Italy, because whilst, yes, they'll be able to build ships, and, well, Germany a lot later will be able to build ships, it'll be a case of, well, you're facing a Royal Navy which is, to a large part, renewed by the time you're getting around to fighting it, and those ships are all going to be individually a lot more capable and a lot more powerful. In fact, you could be talking to a Royal Navy which has experienced 2, maybe even 3 generations of capital ships, possibly even the same in terms of aircraft carriers, by the time World War II begins. In which case, you're in trouble. So, how will I emulate these issues? So, the mandate will be changed. It will be required up until 1926, all units completed will have to be conversions. Okay. Not going to worry the Royal Navy too much, but they're probably not going to be able to stop the construction of Hermes. But that's fine. They're already under work. It's new units. Up until 1930, at least 50% of units completed must be conversions. Okay. And it'll only be from then onwards that wholly new construction can be focused on. For the UK, that's fine. You have issues. Again, there will be timeout for the pre-treaty conversions. Not quite calling them experimentals, but they will be able to get rid of from 1930 onwards. Post-treaty conversions would be in service till 1934 at least, and new builds would have a minimum 18-year life, as with capital ships. Ooh. Oh, it works. Hosho. The real cat amongst the pigeons. One of the most efficient light fleet carrier designs ever built. Does have some issues. But honestly, for a first design and construction, Japan really stole a march. And got a capability which, honestly, I would say would have presented an issue at the time for the US Navy. In terms of reconnaissance and support she could give to the fleet, she would have seriously been an advantage for the Japanese Navy in her time when she's first launched. I'm not saying she stays that way. She quickly gets exceeded by bigger and better ships, and the Japanese don't always build to the same level of competent contemporary quality as Hoso, but yeah, she's a very good start. So, final rules. What do they look like? Well, I've got the ratios. I've got the tonnage. Total tonnage. 330,000 tons. Or, well, total tonnage. Oh. USN, 330,000 tons. IJN, 231,000 tons. Marine National and IJN Marina, both 132,000 tons. There are the construction limits. And there are the service lives. Everything is there. 33,000 tons standard. Maximum build for an aircraft carrier. Oh, but this is going to create issues. Because, okay, just as with the battleships, do the USN and the IJN and the Royal Navy build up to the maximum? the Marine National and the IJN Marina build up to the maximum. Because yes, you can build up to 33,000 tons in standard carrier. And honestly, for 3 of those powers, it makes sense to. For the IJN, it allows each carrier to be qualitatively superior. And allows them to carry very strong air wings, and gives them 7 very good carriers. For the Marine National and the IJN Marina, 4 carriers would be absolutely amazing for their fleet. For the IJN Marina, that's pretty much giving them air superiority over their operations with those 4 carriers, because they will have them all in the Mediterranean. For the Marine National, 4 would be not enough. And again, it's sort of, they're going to be the ones faced with issue. They'll probably want to match the IJN Marina, so they will probably end up building 4 Super 1s. But honestly, they need a couple in the Far East, they need a couple in the Mediterranean, and a couple on the Atlantic to guarantee some availability. So really, they need 6. So really, they need to build, 6 22,000-ton ships. Which we know is the tonnage which works. Royal Navy, US Navy, more of an issue. More of an issue. Okay. So, the RN could go for 10 33,000-ton ships, 11 30,000-ton ships, 12 27,500-ton ships, or roughly 15 22,000-ton ships. 15 22,000-ton ships. Sound tempting. But a 22,000-ton carrier taking on a 33,000-ton carrier is probably not going to be a fair fight. Because of efficiencies. Once you get larger in terms of your air group accommodation, support, and maintenance, which the Royal Navy understands. Remember, they're the ones doing those tonnage calculations. I should point this out. The tonnage calculations in that table I didn't have the idea for them. I found them. I found tonnage calculations being done. I did those calculations to check them against the figures they had. So that is my work in my table. But I didn't have the idea for doing those sort of calculations. There were a lot of people doing them at the time. not just around there, but further into the 1920s as well. So, yeah, that's going on. Now, then you have to start thinking about, okay, the capital ship force I have structured around Free Fleet formation. So it's probably got to be a number divisible by 3, because it's going to have to be equally spread across the fleet operating areas. You're therefore left really with 12 or 15 as your options. 22,000-ton carrier versus a 33,000-ton carrier, even if you do have 5 of them to take on whatever, is probably not going to fit in, not be enough. And remembering the lessons of the Implacable class, I think you could build a 27,500-ton carrier, and you'd have 4 of those per fleet. And I think it could work. And I think that's where the Royal Navy probably ends up. I don't think they end up with the 30,000 tons ships. I think they probably end up with a 27,500 tons, because they're looking at carriers for trade protection, reconnaissance, fighting, as initially, and they're going to build up to, they're sort of building up the idea of the strike role, and the strike role's already been sort of considered in the Royal Navy as part of it. So they're thinking about it. Actually implementing it is a different matter. What is the likely build? Well, this is the interesting thing. Do they go convergence or not? Well, you do technically, if you want to build an aircraft carrier prior to 1926, take on any new construction, you're going to go for a conversion. But honestly, (1926 to 1930) is going to be the big time. People are going to want carriers by that point, and they have to match build. So, do I think the Lexingtons still get converted? Yes, I do. Do I wonder what the Japanese carriers might look like if they build them for 33,000 tons? Well, I think especially as I wouldn't be surprised if they get off to a sort of slow construction as well. But again, with that as a limit, well, that's the theoretical limit. I wouldn't be surprised if they pushed that to roughly 35 or so thousand tons. You would get carriers far in excess of what the IJN actually managed to put together. Can you actually build a carrier of that size in this period? Yes, you can. It's a product of naval architecture, and they have experience building ships which are far heavier. And yes, you have to be careful about where you put the weights and the balancing, but you have to be careful about weights and balancing on any ship, and they've already built the Hushok. It's not really a scalable design, but I think they could work it through. The USN is the interesting one. You see, the thing is, they really only have to worry about the Atlantic and the Pacific. And they could decide that 33,000 tons is enough. They did pick that and just build 10 of those, go for 10 33,000 ton ships, and have 5 for each ocean. They could go for 30,000 tons and have ships and have 6 based in the Pacific and 5 based in the Atlantic. Again, they'll have superiority numbers over the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy will only have 4, even if they go for the 12 ships, because they'll have 4 in the Mediterranean and 4 in the ocean. And the thing is, yes, we all know on paper the Mediterranean ones come out, and that backs up the Royal Navy in the Atlantic, so the Royal Navy's not worried about the Atlantic either. But that doesn't give them a decisive number versus and tonnage versus the US Navy. And the US vice versa. So they both feel quite balanced in that scenario. Going for the 27,500 ton one is definitely something which would be very interesting for the US Navy. It would allow them 6 either side, so it would allow them almost as many carriers in a Pacific as the IJN with their 7. I honestly am not sure which way the US Navy would go. They might even go for a combination, and that is something I have considered. That they build conversions of 33,000 tons, they aim for that. And they try and build 27,500 ton new builds, especially during the 1926 to 1930 period. That would make a sort of sense to me. That would make a sort of sense. But it's what they do. It's how they think through and what realities they really think the carriers are going to be used for. And that's going to be the complicated debate. What are carriers for? We know what carriers are for post-1945. You all know that. But what are carriers for in the 1920s? This was a question I wrestled with in my entire PhD. What are carriers for in 1920? What are they for in 1924? What are they for in 1928? What are they for in 1932? What are they for in 1936? What are they for in 1940? That's sort of how I worked it through. And actually, I divided up did it in 2-year sections, really sort of thinking it through. But this is the point you have to think about. What are aircraft carriers for? In 1920, you would not be wrong if you said your carriers are for reconnaissance, air defense, and spotting. That's it. Maybe a little bit of anti-submarine work. In terms of if a submarine's on the surface, they will machine gun it or bomb it. And that is your primary duty of carriers. So only as you get into 1926 further on, strike starts to come in. So, this then brings us to our build program. And I'd like to put in example build programs. And please excuse me that I have put the 2 example build programs I have used for theoretical build programs are both the British ones, because honestly, the permutations once you get into this, you've gone so far beyond the the real circumstances were in total tonnage allowance that I felt it necessary to stick in the area which I have the most intimate knowledge of. And I did go back to my notes on the USN and my notes on the IJN, and I have ideas for what I would want to put them in. And I wrestled with the idea of putting those tables in this video. But I decided ultimately those would be things I wanted to examine further, do some more reading before I actually displayed what I think they might have been. And it comes mostly down to how many of the Lexington class you convert. And that mostly comes down to, in my mind, which program the Royal Navy goes with. Under this program, I've had them sticking with the Courageous class. Now, the reason they stick with the Courageous class is because have a look at those tonnage figures for Furious, 22,900 tons. For Courageous and Glorious, 24,000 tons, well, nearly 25 in the case of Glorious. They are far and away below the maximum limit. The Royal Navy is pursuing numbers. And those are then traditional numbers. But you also notice I've factored in a new build. And the new build is 27,500 tons. Why did I go for a new build of 27,500 tons? Well, that was an interesting one for me. I did consider going with the 22,000 ton option. But I had a theory that if I went with a 22,000 ton option, I would be building too many ships. But also, I had a theory they wouldn't go with it. And I have this reason why. The Royal Navy is ultimately conservative in many of its procurement practices. If you tell them they can build a carrier which will have a decent air group and armor, and most of the sums do work out at roughly 27,000 tons in standard, they will probably head for that. Now, what kind of armoring would that new build have? Where would its strength deck be? I would say for the first generation, the strength deck is going to be below the hangar deck. They're probably still going to have a steel deck on top. That's British go with that quite early. But the strength deck, the armor won't be that. The armor will be below the hangar level. So it'll be a case of, we've got a bomb on top, but the rest of the hull's fine. So if that goes up, we can get the hull in and fix the stuff on top. I think that would change in idea roughly around about 1932, which is why I've got those doubling orders. So I think the first new build is an experimental of 27,500 tons. We've got 300. We look at all the tonnage we've got to build with. We've got 330,000 tons. We're allowed to be building up to 66,000 tons in terms of construction at any one point. You're going to do it. You might even go with a 33,000 ton ship, but I don't think you would. I think 27,500 tons is where they'd end up. And basically, my theory is they try that, and that is the sweet spot for them, so that's where they end up sticking. And then they end up churning them out. And you'll notice, yeah, I've not gone for an aggressive construction plan. And by the time you've got to 1944, you've theoretically got one a year entering service. Now, that's, of course, if peace doesn't break out. Peace doesn't end in 1939, and no, the treaty system doesn't break down in 1937. But you will have had several generations of carriers built. This will change the position of the fleet air arm of the Royal Navy. A treaty like this would make, and the numbers of carriers would make the fleet air arms continue controlled by the Royal Air Force, well, rather by the Air Ministry, not the Royal Air Force. Part of the Air Force in many ways, but its personnel came from the Navy, and it was more the, as I often try to point out, is you have to draw a difference between the RAF as a group and the Air Ministry, which was part of that group as and itself as an organization. The Air Ministry is more often not the problem. In fact, always, if it's not the RAF which is the problem for the Fleet Air Arm and Admiralty running the Fleet Air with involvement in the Fleet Air Arm, it's the Air Ministry and their perception of what the Fleet Air Arm is for. Their plans for aircraft carriers to be used to transport their aircraft out to the Far East, then come back, pick up the Fleet Air Arm aircraft, and then be able to use that, or for the Fleet Air Arm aircraft to be used to taken all ashore and used to support the Air Force in expeditionary operations, leaving the Navy without aircraft. That is not really a sensible military operational plan. That is a single service plan. And the thing is, the RAF, if you look at their their officers, especially in the people who end up in fighter command, those things, never really had those ideas. They didn't think of that as being a sensible plan either. So, this is it with the courageousness. However, there is an option. And again, I've gone with some conversions. And the conversions I put in is that Furious gets cancelled. And starting with the G3s, and I went with the G3s because you've got 4 of them. They're all at a very early start of the build. They would count as conversions, but let's be honest, there isn't really much there that's built in the first place for you to be converting, but you've ordered all the long lead items, so you can get them into service quite quickly. And they are 33,000-ton carriers, or rather 30,000-ton carriers. Now, this makes a very different scenario for the Royal Navy. Yes, there are less aircraft carriers in total numbers than if they're all 27,500 tons. And yes, we go down to single build order a lot sooner. In fact, in the previous version, we are still you're still building 2 up to 1936 build order. And in this one, well, you're only 2 new builds on the 1932 build order. You've got 2 27,500-ton new builds built, and you've got the 4 30,000-ton G3 conversions. Now, your difference does get interesting, but the difference is never above the construction allowance, and therefore you're always able to keep constructing. What does this mean for the Royal Navy? Well, it means they would have 4 strike carriers at any one point, and roughly 8 at this peak, 8 fleet carriers. Now, please note, at its peak, technically the difference is 37,500 tons, which is greater than the tonnage of any of the Royal Navy's individual carriers, and greater than that carrier under construction by 10,000 tons. So technically, in 1942, they'd be 10,000 tons over on this plan. My theory is they get round it by making sure the 30,000-ton carriers were gone before the new 27,500-ton ship entered service. But 1942 would be the peak year, and they'd have 12 carriers of that. The rest of the time, they'd always have slightly less. But they could still build free, functioning fleets, and they would have 4 carriers, which would, on paper, and probably in reality, stand up to any other carrier in the world. And it would use the G3s. And it would allow new construction during that period when you have to sort of be careful about whether you're using conversions or new builds. Had an interesting idea then about what would a G3 carrier look like. And, well, it came into sharp focus when I was actually discussing things with a naval architect friend of mine, and then when I went and discussed them with some of the naval architects and naval interested people on my Discord channel. I would start off with going, under that scenario, the bridge island structure would look very much like Eagle's. But Eagle is 203 meters long. Ark Royal is 240 meters long overall, but 19.91 meters long at the waterline. The G3 is 260 meters long. If you add on a flight deck hangar structure at about the level you could, sort of the main deck level, possibly raise it up a little bit higher and extend that structure, the R superstructure, to the length of the ship, build the hangar, island structure, etc. on top of that. Probably have to trunk the funnels so they go boom and up. And you could do that quite easily if you consider the level of the actual G3 construction. You would have a very big flight deck. The G3's beam is 32.3 meters. The Eagle's, on the flight deck level, is roughly 35.1 meters. The Ark Royal's is 28.9 meters. So you would have something that you could quite easily probably add a little bit more on it, make the beam up to, well, the flight deck level beam, up to probably not far off Eagle. But would probably give you another 60, 70 meters in length of flight deck, which is more than Ark Royal has, and would be a very large hangar space. Lift layout not too dissimilar to Ark Royals in terms of free lifts. They would have plenty of space for doing their own aircraft maintenance and can carry a large aircraft complement. They would probably be the carrier flagships of any of the carrier squadrons. It's something to think about. If my design skills were better and if I had more time with CAD, I would probably draw up my own designs. But I haven't, at the moment, so far done it. And I would say that if I were to bet on how the structure would go, you're not going to move the engines around and the engine layout. So they're going to stay in the same place. That's going to stay in the same place. In which case, the island structure is probably going to, if you, again, take the Eagle's island structure, you can probably match up the funnels roughly with the funnel positions and the structure up there. So actually, the structure will be slightly further aft than it is historically on Royal Navy ships, which could develop into a different whole pattern. But it's an interesting idea. It is a very interesting idea, and it would produce a very capable ship. Now, why am I not mentioning a forward flying off position, a lower deck flying off position? Well, there is a reason for that. Most of the discussions I have seen and I have read, which talk about the potential of larger carriers, talk about twin-engine aircraft. A 260, 270 long meter flight deck with 34 meters beam, maybe even 35, could probably make that a viability. It certainly have the capacity. Now, why is that interesting? Again, it would be another point of departure from existing history. There are debates over the reliability of twin-engine versus single-engined aircraft at the time, and there are things you can certainly look into it. But with the increasing reliability of engines and power of engines as they went on, a twin-engined aircraft configuration would offer some interesting points of development. It would allow you to carry a larger, more powerful warload. It would allow you to get around some of the issues which you have providing necessary power and performance on a single engine. Really, for the British, the actual implementation of the various Griffin and Napier Sabre variants and other engines of comparable time which come out. So, it'd be interesting. Ultimately, all of this is, of course, a theoretical idea of what an equitable treaty would look like and what an equitable treaty would be. But it is necessary to consider, because None of these things would happen in isolation. All of it's connected. And the whole point of an equitable treaty system, especially a treaty system which is supposed to bring about peace, is it has to be fair, provide hope, and so people feel secure and safe, whilst also providing incentive to maintain it, so that your advantage lies in keeping the treaty. That's how you incentivize nations to actually abide by a treaty. It has to be advantageous for them to keep to it. They can feel secure, but as long as they're keeping to it, others have to keep to it, and therefore they are safe. The Washington Treaty and to an extent the London treaties go too far because they prevent construction as their way of trying to keep things in their sort of safe spot. In many ways, what they do, though, rather than providing a safe period, is again I've said this before, but it's always worthwhile mentioning again. They almost replicate the immediate period after the launch of HMS Dreadnought. In that everyone knows technology is getting better. Everyone knows this new thing has just arrived. And instead of taking advantage of it and Britain using it to stamp its authority and going, we now have 8 of these and 4 Invincibles, by the way, so we have 12 Dreadnought ships in the service and none of you yet have any. Better behave. Because we're big. In this case, we're talking about a period where America and Britain have lessons from World War I. France has lessons from World War I. They are able to continue their construction under normal circumstances. But they don't. Because of a treaty, because it was the war to end all wars, because they want peace. And again, the whole thing which is people are going to find annoying through this entire series of videos is I'm going to keep repeating this phrase. I'm going to repeat it as often into the zeitgeist as I can so that hopefully it starts to actually take on a form of its own and actually infect national discussions and national debate. Sive pacem para bellum. Those who should seek peace must first prepare for war. Should first prepare for war. Peace doesn't come through waging war. Peace comes through being prepared so that war is too costly in anyone's calculations. Or rather, is costly enough. If you're too prepared, then people act out of fear. If you're not prepared enough, people act out of greed. Hubris. It is a balance. Deterrence is a balance, whether it's conventional deterrence or nuclear deterrence. It is a balance. We get into trouble with treaties and peace negotiations and these things when we try and tip the scales too far from their natural point of balance, which is probably not equal. It's going to be off, but if we try and tip it too far, or when we try and remove the scales completely, so people don't know what their relative position is, that's when you get into trouble. That's when you actually sow the seeds of war. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. And what I want you to do, if you have watched the whole way through this video, is I want you to comment below with what you think your G3 carrier names would have been. What 4 names would you have chosen for your 30,000-ton G3 carriers? I'm looking forward to that. I want to hear what they're going to be called. Thank you. Right, what have we got coming up? This is going out on the 12th? No, 10th of April? And so the 12th of April is the Leipzig class. Woohoo! There is going to be no video on Monday. I'm sorry, there isn't. There is only one of me, and I am currently, as you heard in the video beginning, off being in charge and very pompous in charge of, well, not quite 100, many teenagers. And I therefore don't think I'll be getting a chance to actually record any videos, but I'm hopefully going to be writing a whole load of PowerPoints while I'm there. So I'll be able to do a massive recording spree once I get home. I get home on, what's the point? I get home on the 14th, which is why I have scheduled the 14th, the Titanic one, for when I have on the 14th, for the time I have in the evening. So I will be back in time for it. But if it suddenly gets pushed later, you'll know why. I'm stuck in traffic on the M25. Thank you, everyone. And I also promised to talk about what's going to be happening in June at the end here. So there will be lives just on Canadian time. So as you see, as I mentioned earlier, I have structured a whole load of long patrols on the Washington-London Treaty series, which will hopefully be coming in. I'm going to be writing and then recording after I get back. And the whole purpose, they will be coming up, but they will be going out at the normal time, UK time. And then at some point, you might well find flash up without much notice, but it'll be I'll try and give about an hour or a bit's notice, live scheduled. And there'll be Q&A updates on what we've been doing in Canada, some chats about all the stuff we've been going on, and basically probably saying thank you a lot to everyone for funding and supporting Canada. It really is going to be a very cool trip, and thank you. Every bit of money I have coming in from Patreon, from super chats, from the fundraising is going towards Canada trip. And honestly, I'm probably spending way too much, but I've basically decided it's the treat from years of COVID, and it's going to get everything put into it. Anyway, thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed. Take care, everyone. Thank you, and thank you very much again.